Wagner, the American comedian, once famously remarked that men who've had their ears pierced are better prepared for marriage. According to Rita, they've experienced pain and they're accustomed to buying jewelry. Our job here is not to help the marital prospects of the unattached members of this audience. Our job is to help people be better prepared for the digital transformations of your organizations. And we've all heard a very provocative presentation from Peter Weil this morning where he challenged the concept and progress that we are making in this country towards the transformation of our businesses. Peter and I spoke beforehand, and what Peter was keen for us to explore in this panel discussion was the challenge of explosions. And I think explosions is an interesting word because on the one hand, explosions implies blowing up, destroying. But explosions also are a release of energy. Can we harness that force of energy that comes from an explosion to make a better business? And I think that's what we're going to explore in this panel. I'm fortunate to be joined, besides Peter, with 3 experienced IT executives. And the explosions fall into one of 4 categories, and we've got 4 people on the panel, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to deal with a particular explosion and draw on their own personal experience in that. Let me introduce the panelists. Besides Peter, I've got Felicia Truen. Felicia has been the CIO at AustralianSuper since 2018. Felicia's background includes work with the ANZ Bank, Deloitte, and Microsoft in her career. And I'm going to ask Felicia to look at the issue of the platform mindset and her experiences about how we can address that. Next to Felicia, I've got Christy. Christy Hay is part of the digital transformation team at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. I don't think I say PricewaterhouseCoopers anymore. PwC. And I want you to think about that environment because I'm going to ask Christy to talk about organizational surgery. How do you do organizational surgery on a business which is nearly 200 years old, which is owned by the partners of that business and has been successful for that period of time? And how do you encourage them to look at the world through a different prism? Next to Christy, I've got Donna Vinci. Donna is currently a non-executive in a startup, but Donna has an extensive experience as a CIO in leading Australian household brands, people like IAG, Citigroup, Bank of Queensland. So you draw on, and Peter's, if you heard Peter's presentation, he also mentioned the challenges of the financial services sector, where progress in transformation sometimes is 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. So how do you get that progress going? I'm going to start the discussion, and I'm in this floor because I want people around me to be asking questions rather than myself. But I'm going to start the discussion with the area of platform mindset. Now, Felicia, we had a chat. We interrupted your son's singing lessons to talk about this. Now, I don't know whether you were enthused by song from that singing lessons, but you told me in very passionate terms the importance of getting the platform mindset right. You spoke to me about this not being flick the switch for vaudeville. This is not a quick fix. This is some journey that people need to be on. They need to lay the foundations before you can transform. And the challenge I see in that is, how do you deal with an executive who are impatient for success, who can't see the technology advantages of reusability, integration, modularity, all of those factors? You need to lay those foundations. They need to make a leap of faith. How do you get them to make that leap of faith?
I would say one of the things is that, firstly, being able to really clearly articulate what the future you want, what you want to be when you grow up. And that's a hard thing to do. It sounds very simple, but it is quite hard. We're a $185 billion long-term investor. Our DNA is predicting the future really well to be able to continue to give great returns. But yet, we find it very hard to say, here's where we want to be. It's also very hard to make decisions. It's hard to prioritise. It's hard to stay the course. And it's very hard, even if you can convince your board and your CEO of this is where we need to go to, but if it's multiple years, and the audience talked a bit with you about this morning, Peter, to be able to demonstrate metrics that show progress along that journey, that's quite difficult. Yeah. The second thing I'd say is that most organisations are still human systems. So they're, by their nature, slightly dysfunctional and slightly irrational. We make short-term decisions over long-term. We make decisions that are about ourselves or our teams over the organisation. And you see this like constantly. Someone I was talking to recently, we were talking about the lawnmower market. So you might not know this, it's about $1 billion market. It's growing at about 35% in Australia. We're the second biggest in this region. Not everybody needs their own lawnmower. But if you sat down with your street, if you have a yard, and said, okay, we're going to have one lawnmower, you have these conversations about what's the spec going to be like? How are we going to fund it? Who's going to maintain it and look after it? Where are we going to store it? And how are we going to govern who uses it when? The same thing happens when you have platform discussions. We have a mentality at AustralianSuper that we try and approach what we call colleague experience in the same way we approach member experience, which is our customers, to say that I provide a service to colleagues as an internal IT function. However, I have a call centre. I have an IT service desk. We also have a call centre that deals with our members. Trying to come together and have a conversation about single-use, reusable assets and APIs around that is harder than you would think. The one last thing I'll say, which is something Peter and I and you and I were talking about earlier, which is possibly more prevalent for the folks in financial services, is about the current fear culture that exists and the blame culture that exists. And for me, I'm a financial services executive. The artist formerly known as BEAR, which is now going to be FAR, the Financial Accountability Regime, I'm going to have $1 million personal bounty on my head if I screw up. Every conversation I have with the board is about risk. And for the number of cybersecurity incidents that have happened of late, our friends at Toll have gone through one 2 weeks ago. That's a if but for the grace of God go I. That could happen to any of us. It is very hard when you have something that can go up the axis of customer experience and across the axis of operational efficiency. That's the thing you need to do. And someone says, what will the regulator say? What if? Security, risk, compliance. So that makes those decisions really hard to stick for the long term.
Yeah, a couple of things, and I will like to get in the discussion. Risk as a factor that can paralyze people, but also can be a motivation for people to try and change. And I also like the point you were saying about framing an argument in how a business itself might frame an argument. So an investor encourages people to think long term about that. So should we not think long term about our business?
Yeah, we use that with the investments department a bit.
Yes, okay. Christy, I'm interested in PwC because it is a very successful global brand. In Australia, I believe you've got something like 700 partners, all who have a stake in the way that company works. They've got to be a partner because they demonstrate the ability to attract revenue to that organization. So they feel good about themselves as individuals, as professionals. And somebody from the digital transformation team comes along and says, look, you've got to change the way you work. How do you foster that argument for organizational surgery in a business that has been so successful?
Yeah, it's not easy, obviously. Basically coming to somebody and saying, well, how you do things and how you've done it well needs to change going forward so that we've still got an organisation moving forward. I'm going to explain a little bit about what we've done at PwC and then come back to answer the question specifically. So what we started with is, we had to get leadership buy-in. We can't do it without leadership buy-in. As you said, we've got 700 partners. If we've got half of them doing it and half not, we've got no chance of doing a complete organisational surgery, to use the term. So what we needed to do, we started with a digital fitness assessment. So got everybody on board, encouraged everybody to take this 15-minute assessment to see how digitally fit are you. And what it was doing was introducing people to perhaps concepts that they weren't aware of. So, you know, they might have learned a little bit about machine learning, AI, design thinking, agile. It was all different sorts of things that you could get into. But it also put a little competitive edge on it. So people were saying, oh, what's your score? I got 200, I got 250, I got 300. And so it gave everybody something to talk about. And it was really encouraged by leadership and the partnership. It was a requirement. They all needed to complete this assessment. So it got the topic started. People started talking about it and got them interested. Then we moved on to the next phase, which was really about upskilling all of our staff. So we did we're still doing two different parts to that. One is about training all of our staff and upskilling them, and the focus is really on data analytics, so wrangling, insights, all of that sort of thing, because data is so important to us and the work that we're doing. So getting everybody on board and doing that. And then we specifically took people out of the business and basically reskilled them and said, this is your new job. We want you to be experts in this area and not only support the rest of the firm going through the training, but go out to your clients and change what you're doing. It's like, look at where the opportunities are for automation, look at where we can digitize things, think differently. Like, what are we doing currently that we don't need to do? What are we doing currently that could be automated? How do we change what we're doing? And that's really, you know, from a people experience, is really motivated people, because they're going, oh my goodness, you're investing my future. We've heavily invested in time to train people and reskill them to what's relevant today. And then we've got our platform, our digital lab, and what that is where we put all the digital assets. So really encouraging people to contribute and share. So if I build an automated task or something out of a client side or a digital asset, I post it, I get rewarded for it. So you can actually build rewards for posting, for people using it, and also we give points to people for actually using other people's. So encouraging that collaboration across the business. How we convince people to do all this in the first place, so part of it is the leadership. We had the benefit of the US going through this transformation, and so they had a lot of data around hours saved through automation and digitization. So numbers always talk, as most of you will know when you're talking to executive. When you talk numbers, it helps. So anything around real life examples, work they've done with clients where you've taken hours out and you're actually being able to save time and do things more efficiently helps. We also, we use a lot of examples. So we had, say, our CIO talking to senior consultants about things that they've specifically done at client sites. And so taking real life scenarios and saying, what did you automate? How long did that take you? So we had one of the senior cons saying, look, we were doing these spreadsheets and we had like 20 spreadsheets and we were pulling all of this data together. So things that are really relatable. And he said, we used to spend 3 weeks doing that every year. And so he automated it, and it now takes half an hour. And they can now focus their time with the clients on providing insights. And so it's not all about just going, here's the figures, here's what it said. It's like, this is what it means and this is how you can improve. So we're changing the client experience as well. And so you're trying to, you know, you're improving your staff's job, you're improving the experience for clients. Hopefully you get some benefit from the bottom line from it as well, because you're able to produce things that are, you know, automate things and you're not taking as long to do it. And I think, you know, those real life examples make a really big impact. And it's building it up bit by bit. We also did things like internally, you know, we did have to do a bit of the low-hanging fruit to start with to convince people that, you know, it's worthwhile, because yes, people do want to see short-term returns and the gains. So, you know, we built some internal bots and say something that impacts, you know, say 70% of staff, automate that and say, great, look, now you've all physically felt it. You've all seen something that used to take you 2 weeks and have multiple touch points and emails going back and forth all over the place can now be done without you having to do anything besides saying, bang, let's go, do it. Okay, I've seen it at the end, send it off. So all of those sorts of things are helping people see the real benefit. So it's making it tangible. And of course, because we're an accounting firm, we have many dashboards and statistics and information. So we're trying to show continuous, you know, value through the hours digitized, the amount of, like, all of our digital products that we're implementing internally as well, you know, that's usage and adoption. So showing all of those things as well, so that people are continuously encouraged And hopefully, you've got all your keen people that get in there to start. That's great, that works. And then you've got your people that, kind of wait and see how the first round go, and they're all getting on board. And now, because we've got so many examples and you've got all the statistics and information, it's much easier to pick up everybody else. So it keeps going, and we've got to, really focus on how does this become the new way of working going forward, and it becomes the norm, and it's not just a thing that we're doing. And so we're trying to embed that into our organisation. It's like continuous transformation and change.
It's interesting, Christy, if I look at that chart there, the one with the biggest lag is in organisational surgery. So seeing PwC make moves in that area, I think, is an inspiration for others for ways that they can help do those changes in their business. But you introduced the term of new ways of working. Donna, you've been around organisations that have had to transform. You've had to get people to think new ways of working, things like agile, the concept of what is an organisation these days, the gig economy, the use of contractors. One day they may be working for you, one day they may be working for the rivals, how you foster that sort of collaboration between those people. And yet Peter stressed in his presentation that the biggest impediment to transformation is the issue of a common language. And you've got this large organizations, the intensity of the financial services environment. How do you foster that common language when you're trying to do a transformation?
I think the first sort of aspect of it is actually understanding the barriers to that success. There's probably two key areas that I see, and it's not technical. I think we're sport for choice for the technology solutions. It really comes down to resistance and resilience of the organisation. From a resistance perspective, we're wired from over many years and of how to operate, and that's sort of led to success of our organisations and so on. To try and start to now peel that away and introduce new ways of working, new ways of labour force, new ways of techniques and tools and so on, it completely disorientates an organisation. How to take them on that journey is really important. But then the resistance side of it is there's an immunity of that, against that change built in. So you go where you're safe, where there's a lot of external factors around, regulatory sort of, change, etc. It really forces your hand to be short term and not have that resilience through those explosions that are taking place. So you need to face into both of those sort of areas, I think, in order to create that sort of breakthrough. For me, having a common language and the frameworks that that Peter and the team sort of provide is a great way of getting onto that sort of common idea around what the pathways are, the language on how you're going to get there, etc. And it gives everybody permission to actually be in that zone for that period of time, and understand sort of that discomfort and work through it. But in order to do that, you need to take everybody on the journey. So whether that's from the board or all the way through to new employees and new partners, etc. They all have to be on that same journey. If you don't have that rhythm together, you actually get friction. And when you get friction in that system, it just fuels the resistance and lowers your resilience. So it's a really important piece that, when you look across all of these sort of pathways, you have to look at what makes them successful to actually understand those challenges first, and then you can sort of approach this common language and work through. For me, in my experiences, it's been a really an immersive type technique, is taking people on that journey. So showing them what good looks like, going to organisations that have done this before, turning the organisation into much more of a learning organisation. So pivoting when something's not going right, but holding that course. It's really important to sort of hold that course. You may course correct, and I think some of your models, when to turn right and when to sort of go up and step and whatever. They're really important when to change, even sort of if you go sort of the fourth one around the sort of decision rights. There's a point where you have to change some of that course, and you need to be able to anticipate it. You need to know it's coming. You need to know what those lead indicators are and the lag indicators, and really sort of face into that. There's going to be a lot of bumps in the road. It's never going to be easy, and that's really where the culture comes into it. You really do need to build up that sort of cultural sort of muscle around resilience and understand where that resistance sort of sits. So rewiring the organisation for for governance, for risk, for procurement, all those sort of hurdles that sort of, people can revert back to type. And there's a lot of change going on in many organisations, in financial services, there's a lot of leadership change, a lot of personnel changes and so on, and that also hits, and challenges momentum as well. So how do you see through that? How do you sort of ride through that cycle and keep that momentum going? The language is really important, I think. It sort of gives people sort of that common comfort level around where are we playing, what are we looking out for, and how do we sort of work together.
Okay. Peter, you've said you've spent most of the last year in America, so you may be unaware of the machinations going on in the National Party right now, but it's a real textbook example that people don't give up power very easily. People have a very heightened view of their self-importance in an organization, and yet you're talking on decision rights about relinquishing power. People who are in authority, who are used to command and control, now being told actually they need a more consensus approach. They need to engage people who they may have seen in the past as their subordinates. What are your thoughts about how you can get decision rights to work?
Thank you. Before I answer that question, I just want to comment on Felicity and Donna, because I've worked with them both, and I'm not as familiar with Christie's work at PwC. But they've made a lot of progress in their organisations. They're focusing on the challenges facing them today, but the progress that has been made at AustralianSuper and previously at BOQ in these areas of of new ways of working and platforms is enormous. And so another thing we have to be good at is smelling the roses along the way. We are very good at seeing the challenges. I would tell you, though, there's a human characteristic I notice in successful executives, and that is that they embrace, as these three people do, the next challenge. That they just say, okay, tick, and we're on to the next challenge, right? And you heard that in the comments. And that's what it takes to transform. And decision rights is the first explosion you have to deal with on all the pathways. The order then changes after that depending on the pathway you're on. So if you're on the path one, the industrialization, decision rights is first and then platform is second. But if you're on the customer experience, path two, the first one's decision rights and the second is new ways of working. And so decision rights, there are a number of areas we measure and look at. The hardest one is the difference between who has the rights to say what versus how. And that is probably fundamentally the thing you have to focus on in decision rights. So if you imagine you're running a bank and you've got 5 or 6 lines of business, each of them decide how they want to go to market, and that's the what. But if you allow each of those individual businesses to then decide the how, you end up with fragmentation, not the platform mindset, multiple new ways of working, and regular surgeries that don't add up. And so that's where we start. And to your point, that challenges people who have been in more hierarchical models. Let me just give you 2 examples in financial services. Probably the best performing bank in the world at the moment is DBS. I mentioned them earlier, Singapore-based bank. One of the few banks, the stock price has significantly increased. They just reorganized their decision rights around 22 platforms. And so instead of lines of business, instead of focusing on product, they have created 22 platforms, one of which is a small business platform. And they have a 2-in-the-box decision right model, which is the leader of the business and the leader of the technology, who together make decisions about whether a project will go ahead, what will be reused, and what are the performance metrics. It's early days, it's only been in place a year, but it's a very different way of thinking of an organization, a much more digital way. And the whole question of alignment goes out the window. And I think we've been trying to align for too long. We should just give up. I mean, it's really not an achievable goal. And so, therefore, what are the new models to look at? So that's one model. Another one that I particularly like is BBVA, which is a very large Spanish bank, operates in 34 countries. 2 years ago, they did something very radical, which is sort of combining all 4. And that is, they said, this alignment problem's driving us crazy. The CEO at the time, Francisco Gonzalez, said, in a digital world, we shouldn't be aligning IT operations and product. They're the same thing, in financial services anyway. So he combined them together into a single group called Engineering Banking Services, and then he gave the decision rights to the country heads to decide what product, at what price, to which segments, but how it's delivered was a technology board. And they've just launched a new app that won the best app in the world through Gartner's assessment, and it is a common app across the globe for the first time with a different skin in each country. And that was achieved through a changing of decision rights. So I think we have to use some new ways of thinking, new models around these decision rights.
Yeah, but I picked up the importance of the person at the top recognizing this was a different way of working in terms of he needed to take a different approach to how he harnessed the resources in that organization going forward. Now, Peter is very keen to get the questions from the floor of what people said. So if you've got questions, can you put your hand up and let me know? I've got Charlotte there with the microphone ready. But as you're thinking of a question to ask on the area of explosions, all of you spoke about the importance of metrics, of ways of keeping others in the business aware of what's going on. What things should you be reporting to those in the organization around you? How regularly should you be doing it? And what are the best ways to get those messages across? Is there anybody who wants to start on that one?
I can start.
Go on, Felicia.
So we have, on the positive side of things, as Peter was just talking about, we've done a lot of work in terms of what does our governance look like, and what sort of, so we have a new technology and data committee at the sub-board level. We now do a business engagement forum across our technology portfolio versus the traditional kind of steering committees and working groups. And that really helps in terms of having an audience who is dedicated with time to talk about what you need to talk about. The metrics that we actually present to them, we've taken a little bit of our own metric to say, let's try and over-communicate. So we haven't reached a point where people have said, you know, I'm actually sick of hearing about the progress of technology in a voice that I understand. We haven't reached that, but we're going to push pretty hard. And we do everything around business outcomes. So we've blown up a lot of the streams of work that we used to have that were, you know, projects that were acronyms, names of streams that were about assets you were building, and said we must name them about business outcomes. We have one that I love that's called colleague experience. That includes everything from Windows 10 to SharePoint to every other kind of boring thing you can find in Office 365. But we're centering it around that, and we say, what has changed around the colleague experience? Are they more productive and efficient? What do people say about their experience of using these machines? And the same thing with an entire group of people who are working on member experience that is all focused on NPS on an ongoing basis.
Is this a dashboard, or how do you present it?
Some is a dashboard, so we've been working with Google around that. So we use a lot of GCP now to be able to present our data. It is harder to get the data together than we would have liked. So we have another piece of work that's called Fund Data Solution that's all around better, more resilient, more centralised data assets. It's sort of running in parallel. Yeah.
But it's interesting because some of those experiences are subjective in some way. So actually quantifying certain personal experiences, it's a tricky thing to be able to get something like that.
It is, and when you have an organisational narrative for a long time, which is not necessarily us, but in some organisations I've worked in, which is the tech team at the bottom of the food chain, the tech team are not good at what they do. If anything goes wrong, it's the tech team's fault. When you present people with data that says, actually, maybe it was a decision that was made elsewhere, then you start challenging that, and you end up with this great organisational culture of people going, your job's hard, my job's hard, we need to work together for a common goal.
But you're alluding there, Felicia, and I like the other panelists' thoughts on this, in that friction between being operationally effective and efficient and also the need for an organisation to innovate. And how do you marry what in many ways are conflicting forces to progress the organisation together? Has anybody got any thoughts about how you can have that done?
I think the change in metrics is absolutely critical. So that measure of success, and one of the things which, you know, to sort of build on on the comments just made is around some of the lead indicators. So that time to decision. If you're measuring the time to decisions and that you're not relitigating decisions, that takes a lot of noise out of the system and a lot of investment and capital sort of being wasted along the way. So we measure that. The other one is around the time to value, and whether that's an employee experience, a member or a customer sort of experience, how much time to get to that value proposition is another sort of lead indicator. Off the back of that then comes some of the other sort of measures that build that up. So what part of the system has changed, where we're seeing the productivity, etc. But you know, time to decision and time to value is really important.
Okay. Those are critical measures, and they cause a lot of friction in organisations when they're not good. I would add one more feature, and that is we're entering a world of extraordinary transparency. I mean, we were just talking about regulators before. They want to see everything, but so does the board, and so do the people who work in your organisation. And so this notion of a hierarchy, that's why I asked about the dashboard, is going away, and we have to be much more willing to share the good news and the bad news, because the team is engaged in fixing it. And no more important is that than boards. So I'm seeing a lot of work being done on board dashboards that look at exactly those issues that board members can look at any time. So it's not just at board meetings.
Yeah.
One thing Peter mentioned in his, again, I'm wanting questions for the floor, so don't, sorry, Mohan, you go. Sorry, hang on, Mohan, I'll just get that. Yeah. Go on.
I am Mohan. I used to be till recently CTO and CISO of Australian Defence. Looks like mutually exclusive, they're not. Just have a question for you, Peter, about decision rights and your thoughts on vesting the decision rights with future leaders rather than current leaders. Because one of the things that Australian Air Force did when they introduced their innovation project was it was given to the wing commanders and group captains, because who in 5-6 years time would actually eventually become air vice marshals or whatever, so that they can own the decisions. So I just want to know your thoughts, because you can't blame the previous leaders for the decisions.
I love that idea, and I'll just give you a quick example following on from the BBVA. So when they created this engineering banking services group, they then said, well, we're going to get 300, they're now up to 400 agile teams to create customer experiences, and they gave them decision rights to go to market as long as they reused the components from the engineering banking services. And then they ran into a problem with the risk, which is they had to go knock on the door of Mr. or Mrs. Risk and say, hey, can we have this, is this okay? And that was slowed everything down. So they put a risk person on each of the agile teams and gave them, I won't tell you the number, but it was pretty high, a cap of $1 million of risk that they could sign off on without going. So it's exactly your point. But if you think about it, it's a lovely clean decision rights, the what versus the how. You know, and that I think is the important part. You can't decentralize it completely, because then you know what you end up with, right?
I think as long as you have the risk appetite really clearly articulated, and you can sort of move that. So what value is actually at risk changes the whole dynamic. Because when you really break it down, there's probably not as much at risk as what you perceive, and that's really important. One of the other techniques that we use is actually, again, this sort of immersion of actually putting our risk people, not just in the agile teams and finance people and procurement and so on, but actually also giving them time where we paid them to go and work in startups, to go outside, get an outside in, and they come back in so it was every Wednesday for 12 weeks. They'd come back in and they'd really think about how they're operating and how they're constraining their thought processes and policies needed to be rewired. And so you saw an acceleration of that motivation to change, to unlock the value for the organisation.
Another question here.
I wasn't sure where this orange box had gone. I just want to dig into something that Donna said around resistance and decision rights, because I look at a lot of senior leaders now, and they come from a world of command and control, not collaboration. So in that initial conversation, Peter, how do you navigate that reality for them, because I've got 3 or 4 clients at the moment. If I said we want to talk about decision rights, the shutters will go up, and they're like, you're not going to take my decision-making power away from me. How do you change that mindset?
It's a great point, and I'll ask my colleagues to answer because they do it every day. I would say there's 2 parts to decision rights. It's decision rights and accountability, and you can't change one without the other. So if you are holding everyone on the executive committee uniquely responsible for their own P&L, you will never change decision rights. Because, obvious, right? So if you said to them, okay, and we heard some numbers before, if you're 50% accountable for your own P&L and 50% accountable for cross-selling, then the conversation about decision rights for who brings on a client, who gets revenue from the cross-sell, is much more open. So my experience has been you have to do both. You have to resolve the decision rights and the accountability part. And another thing I've learned the hard way is everybody says yes, yes, yes to changing decision rights until it's a decision they have. And then they go, no, 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 whoa. But we're different. You see how excited I get about it? And other thoughts?
That's how they fall off the chair.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the things, at PwC, the decision rights, we always talk about governance with a small g. So with, when we're setting up digital assets and providing a platform for all staff to contribute to, you can imagine from an IT perspective and a risk and a security perspective, that's blowing everybody's minds because everybody's building tech. It's how do you manage that in a way that you're still getting that innovation occurring? And so we have governance in place, but not one that's you have to speak to me before you do it. You have to get approval and funding before you have to do it. So trying to make it less rigid, but still have something in place so that you don't just have a flood of
So how do you deal with the accountability part of it?
Well, I think it's getting that flag on the hill. You know where you're going, and you've got to take people on that journey around feeling competent around making those decisions or relinquishing those decisions to somebody else. Mm-hmm. The only way to do that is really change the way their mindset is reacting to that change, and that takes time. It takes reinforcement, and that's where that sort of resilience comes in. You have to hold the course, because if you sort of start on that journey and then sort of revert back because of some bad decision or another sort of external sort of factor coming in from a competitor or whatever, people get very disorientated and be able to sort of go, I'm actually trying to build this muscle, and then you sort of do it now with your left hand, and then you go, okay, now switch back to your right and left. It's very hard to do. So if you can hold that course and say, actually, we're building this muscle, and we know there's going to be challenges and hurdles along the way, but we're going to sort of work through that cycle together. You have to create that safe environment. So there's sort of definitely sort of techniques on debriefing on those moments. How did we react to that? Did that sort of move us closer or further away? Did it sort of create value or reduce sort of value in the long run?
And this sounds super simplistic, but just remembering to write it down. And to have the conversations about decision rights when you aren't in the middle of a decision. Yes. Because when you have non-emotive discussions, and what we do is we talk about it in that way, we document it, we stress test it with use cases, the what if this happened, what would happen, and then we hold ourselves accountable to when a decision comes up, say this is what we agreed when we weren't in the heat of the moment, we need to stay true to that, and if it doesn't work or there's lessons learned, let's iterate and put that in. So it's simple, but just write it down.
And the platform companies take that written down and build it into the automated decision.
Right. Yep.
So WeChat doesn't have this conversation about who makes decisions. It's in the system. Same with Amazon. Yep. And that's something we haven't achieved yet in a lot
Certainly
of large
not in Australia.
Right. You always know it's a good panel discussion when you've got about 20 other questions that you wanted to ask, especially when you know it's time to move on, and how do you maintain the commitment of these heroic people who keep you going to see the promised land. But we've got to wrap up now, so can we please thank our panelists for their contribution.
Thanks for saying that.